What makes a story? Gallant tales of heroism, valor, and courage in the face of adversity, a fair maiden in need of rescue, a battle won, a kingdom saved, a sunrise earned. These tropes and building blocks are narrative cornerstones, having survived the annals of oral, written, and performative tradition for thousands of years for very good reason. But how can you ensure the audience will be engaged with the story when it's told in a video game? And furthermore, how do you tell a compelling, moving story when not one, but millions of people will be experiencing it? You could go the route of World of Warcraft, scaling up the story and the scope of the consequences more and more, enabling any wayward adventurer to meander their way into the story, but this leaves the world in a constant state of escalation. Introducing bigger and more powerful threats when the scope is already that high means that you run the risk of detachment much more readily. Not to mention that the world largely remains static unless it's the impetus of the story in the first place, such as Cataclysm. In games like these, the story is largely ancillary, something that happens to you rather than because of you. So many MMORPGs do this. They create a world in which events unfold in a predetermined order and give the illusion of choice. But Final Fantasy XIV shows something different, something that broke the mold and garnered a hugely positive response. While the story is mainly a solo experience, only having to interact with other players while doing dungeons or trials, they designed a story in which the player is the Warrior of Light, largely ignoring the multitude of other players that you were fighting alongside. This works because we're already doing this ourselves as the player. Even if we stop to ask ourselves where these other people are coming from, how they're even coming along on these dungeons, trials, and raids with us, the answer doesn't even matter. See, World of Warcraft thought that a story where every player is the protagonist wouldn't work in an MMORPG because you can't have millions of protagonists. Final Fantasy XIV realized this as well, but they found a very simple solution to this dilemma: suspension of disbelief. You can have the most fantastical, ridiculous, larger-than-life story that you want so long as it's told in a way that doesn't fly in the face of the audience's suspension of disbelief. Writing strong, dynamic characters that are consistently characterized so you know how that character will react to events unfolding in front of them, telling down-to-earth, believable stories about people and their struggles, letting the audience sympathize on their own instead of being told to sympathize. There are a lot of things that strengthen it rather than weaken it. But by far the most powerful tool in a writer's arsenal when trying to keep suspension of disbelief intact is a good antagonist. While A Realm Reborn, Heavensward, and Stormblood have very interesting antagonists of their own, in different ways, it's those found in Shadowbringers that most spurred the inception of this video. Before we get underway, I'd like to reiterate that there will be detailed spoilers and discussions about the story in Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers, including patch 5.3, so if you have not yet experienced the story for yourself, I recommend you turn the video off right now and go do so at your earliest convenience. Shadowbringers can only be experienced for the first time once, and I'd kill to be able to do so again, and I don't want to rob anyone's first experience of it either. I'm going to assume that all who watch beyond this point are either fully caught up in the story or truly do not care about spoilers, and I'm going to speak as such. With that out of the way, sit back, relax, and enjoy as I pen an open letter on the antagonists of Final Fantasy XIV and the importance of story in MMORPGs.
Hi. That was what I called myself in your world. The Warrior of Darkness. My real name is Ardbert. It was my comrades and I who caused the flood.
When we first met Ardbert and his Warriors of Darkness, they were clearly meant to be seen as villains. They antagonized the beast tribes around Eorzea, forcing them to resummon their primals, knowing full well the heroic Warrior of Light will show up to fulfill their duty and slay them. When we do inevitably show up to put down the angered beastmen gods, who do we see but a motley crew of adventurers not unlike ourselves? An echo vision shared between us reveals that they were once slayers of Ascians, again, not dissimilar to us. Naturally, we're intrigued. Our interest baits the hook that reels us ever deeper.
Mark well our faces, Warrior of Light. For we are the Warriors of Darkness. Walkers of a different path. And we shall meet again.
His voice is tinged with rage. He actively opposes us for reasons unknown, and his compatriots are ready to kill us at a moment's notice. There's also a sadness, a bitterness there, one that's impossible to tell whether it's inward or outward. The conversations we have are tense, and though it's clear they all resent us, it's unclear as to why they do. All until we have a climactic showdown in the Bowl of Embers, and with shock and horror, we come to a startling revelation.
At long last you see. To save our world, we gave our lives. We were just adventurers trying to make our way. An odd job here, a favor there. We never aspired to be warriors of light. But word of our deeds spread, and soon people were calling us heroes. They placed their hopes and dreams on our shoulders and bid us fight for all that was good and right. We fought, and we fought, and we fought, until there was no one left to fight. We won! and now our world is being erased from existence. We did everything right. Everything that was asked of us, and still it came to this. You of all people should understand. We will not falter. We brought our world to the brink of destruction, and now we must save it.
Listen to the anger give way to pain, guilt. It's after this harrowing revelation that his fellow warriors of darkness begin to embolden him.
I've died before, Ardbert. I'm not afraid to die again.
No matter how many times we fall, we must rise and carry on the fight for those we left behind.
When you first hear this dialogue, there's this gut-wrenching sense of dread and wrongness that begins to build. Notice how similar they sound to the Scions, how thin the line is between us and them. Throughout the game thus far, a very clear theme and mission statement had been set up as precedent. The good guys win, the bad guys lose, and the world is saved. But it's in listening to this speech that we begin to realize they're just like us. We could have ended up just like him if we weren't careful, and we could very well still end up like him if we aren't careful. We meet many people on our journey as a warrior of light that embodies this ideal, but none more so than Ardbert.
We made our choice, and you see what came of it. So please, forge a different path. Seize a better fate.
At first, it's unclear how much of Ardbert's character depth is due to retroactive characterization or very active foreshadowing on part of the writers, but either reality works because of Ardbert's role in the Shadowbringers story. Retroactive characterization is actually invaluable and effective so long as it doesn't retcon any currently present characteristics. I was always hoping we'd see more of him because his character fascinated me so deeply. And who do we see upon returning to the Pendants after traveling around Norvrent?
You can hear me? Oh, gods, how long has it been?
When we initially run into him on the first, he's not even angry. He's surprised, and even more so when it's revealed that in over 100 years, we've been the only one to be able to see or hear him.
My hands find no purchase. My gestures catch no eye, and my pleas, be they whispered or screamed, reach not a single ear. I am a shade, cursed to do naught but drift.
Think, many of us in the real world have spent a year in near total isolation, cut off from many of the people and activities we used to take for granted. Multiply that time spent 100-fold and you might begin to understand Ardbert's anguish, his pain and misery. All throughout Shadowbringers, Natsuko Ishikawa and the team of writers at her back tell us a story of perspective, of the overpowering light threatening to blot out the weakening shadow. It shows us that perspective is utterly critical in any context. Actions that appear villainous may very well be, but could also be done for heroic reasons. And the only way to discern the difference is to do so with your own two eyes. It's in this line blurred between hero and villain that we find Ardbert. He struggles in the gray area he now finds himself. He was, at one time, the hero of the first, savior of Norvrent and warrior of light, but no more. Because of his notion of heroism, he believes he doomed his world. And because his world was doomed, he traveled to the source and engaged in less than heroic behavior. He can neither be a hero nor a villain, and his current physical state reflects that. He's literally caught between two worlds, not dead enough to be gone, but not alive enough to be useful. Too little a hero to save his world, and not enough a villain to fill the role he made for himself.
Minfilia said my time had not yet come. That I still had a role to play. Not even the most valiant heroes can stand alone. No, it couldn't be. There's only one hero in this room, and it is not me. I'm just a shadow, cursed to wander.
Ardbert is a fascinating character, and we see him slowly break out of this purgatory as the story progresses. Even though there's little he can do, he keeps fighting anyway. He embodies a relentless courage in the face of despair that is supremely inspiring to see. This is shown in greater detail during the attack on the Crystarium by the Yulmoran Sin-Eaters. The assembled Scions rally the troops of the Crystarium and wage a counteroffensive, giving their all to a people they've come to know and love only somewhat recently. Ardbert, seeing this, knows full well that as a Spectre there's little he can do to help, so he simply stands and watches, furious at his inability to lend aid. But when he sees one Crystarium soldier administering aid to a dying comrade in arms and is about to be blindsided by a Sin-Eater, his attitude changes completely.
Run! Run, damn you! God damn it! Please let this work. Please let this work. Why did you spare me? Why? What have I done to deserve this mercy?
As this realization strikes him, the sun begins to rise. Those still able to fight amongst the soldiers form up and drive off the remaining Sin-Eaters from their home.
Fight and struggle. Seek salvation by your own hands. Though the losses be grave, endure them. Though the victories be hollow, claim them.
In this moment, he immediately defaulted back to his normal self. He proves to himself, even despite his situation, he is still a hero. He always had been. All doubt is cast aside, and the motive behind even his most unheroic actions are still painted within the context of someone bitter and hurting, but trying to do the right thing. This single moment solidified Ardbert's character arc in my mind as something that is so rare in gaming media. A dynamic deuteragonist allowed to hurt, suffer, and grow, and make independent choices. We may influence that growth, but the inciting moments aren't directly because of us and our actions. Pacifying the cardinal virtues and reuniting Seta with Ardbert's medallion are important and do impact Ardbert's arc, but that's just as much for audience benefit as it is for Ardbert's, and that's a good thing. We've seen him grow and blossom from a one-note, bog-standard Final Fantasy antagonist meant to cast doubt on our actions and beliefs into this infinitely more well-rounded and interesting character. And it's as the story of Shadowbringers is reaching its conclusion that his growth gets thrown into such a stark contrast with who he once was. We've just conquered the illusion of the final days of Amarot cast by Emet-Selch, and we're about to be overtaken by the ambient light we've been absorbing from the defeated Light Wardens. We crumple, coughing up coalescent light reminiscent of our departed friend Tesleen, and collapse, whiting out. We come to our senses somewhat in an all-white expanse, alongside Ardbert's specter. After a tense and heavy silence, he speaks.
If you had the strength to take another step, could you do it? Could you save our worlds?
When we respond, he simply laughs, clearly satisfied. He then hands us his axe as the music begins to swell. In the line between hero and villain, living and dead, Ardbert has made his choice.
Take it. We fight as one.
He isn't avoiding our gaze because of some faux machismo or cynical stoicism, it's because he already knows our answer. All the doubt, all the fear, the indecision, the rage, it's all gone now. Ardbert teaches us that an antagonist isn't always about good versus evil. It can be something personal, something within us, something that challenges us and our ideals. And now, before the greatest threat the Source and its reflections has ever faced, stands the warrior of light and darkness, together as one, now and forevermore.
This world is not yours to end. This is our future. Our story.
You are a mistake. For we who have known perfection, the shattered source and these shards are ghastly mockeries of the true world. The ephemeral lives you exalt are pale imitations, utterly devoid of meaning.
Emet-Selch as Emperor Solus has been a mainstay in the story since even the 1.0 days of the game, but it's only in Shadowbringers that we get any real characterization for him. Before that, he's shown to be quite clever and mischievous, always plotting and planning something, a master manipulator and a dangerous foe. Not knowing his end goal was the biggest thorn in our side until we discovered what it was, that he sought to initiate a rejoining by any means necessary. In doing so, he would reform Zodiark, allowing him to shatter the prison created by Hydaelyn, which would ostensibly be bad for us. One calamity alone is enough to cause untold destruction and ruin throughout the planet, let alone several more yet to come. He initially shows up after we defeat Titania and offers us a deal, to work with him.
I will not raise a hand to hinder your hunt for the Light Wardens. If you desire it, I will even lend you my knowledge and strength.
As this lines up with our current goal, this naturally takes us by surprise, and we are utterly nonplussed at the idea of working with an Ascian. Later in Raktika, he proposes the idea again, that he join the group as an observer, and, much to our chagrin, it would behoove us to accept. After Y'shtola uses Flow again to save herself from falling to her death inside the Ronkin ruins, he literally snaps his fingers and rescues her from the lifestream. A feat that last time this happened required a ton of time and luck he does with a simple flick of the wrist. He bids us to trust him, and we're very much put off by this. What could he want? He's clearly up to something.
You're plotting something.
Every hour of every day. But never you mind about that.
Over the course of the MSQ, we get to see more of his personality. He's campy, dry, painfully obvious in his humor, and almost bored. We, the players, stop seeing him as an Ascian after a certain point, and begin to see him as a real person. He isn't just some monstrous being seeking to sow chaos for chaos' sake behind the scenes, but a real flesh and blood person. And this is quite unnerving, because every time he cracks a joke or says something silly in that posh, dry voice of his and we all laugh at it, there's always that part of our minds that thinks this is the enemy.
No, I think not.
This is so powerful, because every big bad endgame villain in the story thus far has largely been able to be identified on sight. La Habrea and the Empire want to use the ultimate weapon to conquer Eorzea, King Thornton is manipulating the goodwill of his people and the memories people hold for their loved ones to keep themselves at war with the dragons, the Alamegans are fighting literal imperial oppressors who took their ancestral home and bastardized their culture. What you see is what you get. But here, we have things flipped a bit. Emet-Selch is telling the truth. Everything he says to us is true. He has no reason to lie. We already suspect him to not be telling the full story, so why bother trying to hide it when we already know what he's after? But if he can get on our good side and have his plans come to fruition, perhaps even because he's doing so, then all the better, right? What makes this work so well is because we the player don't have a choice other than to go along with it, and neither do the in-universe characters. What option do we have? We're the Warrior of Light and Darkness, let's get to work saving the world already. And so we do, Light Warden after Light Warden falling before us. As those with Hydaelyn's blessing, we're able to contain the refulgent aether within the Light Wardens and prevent them from reforming elsewhere. But the amount of aether within us grows to be too great, and we begin to succumb after destroying innocents atop Mount Gold. At this point, Emet-Selch shows up again, shooting the Crystal Exarch to prevent him from siphoning out the aether and casting himself into the void between shards to save us. He chastises us for being weak, for failing him, and it's when we go to meet him in Amarot after speaking with the denizens there that he lays everything bare. Once all rejoinings are successful and the source is whole once more, Zodiark will be freed and he plans to sacrifice the survivors to resurrect those he lost to circumvent the final days. Emet-Selch's next statement is utterly bone-chilling.
Even now, after everything, you refuse to see reason. You think it unfair that you are subject to suffering, that your lives will be sacrificed for the ancients. Look at me. I have lived 1,000 of your lives. I have broken bread with you, fought with you, grown ill, grown old, sired children, and yes, welcomed death's sweet embrace. For eons have I measured your worth and found you wanting. Too weak and feeble-minded to serve as stewards of any star.
He's hurt. He's angry. He's so utterly disgusted by the idea that we should even be allowed the right to live and thrive while his brethren lie dead and forgotten. That there are 3 unsundered who even remember what life was like before the sundering, before the final days. The notion that our suffering, our struggles, our hopes and dreams are anything more than ashes in the wind is absurd to him. Not because he believes he is above us per se, but because we are not whole. Consider, would you still keep a ceramic plate if it broke? No, you'd throw it out, right? What if it was a piece of fine china, an heirloom? At the very least, it would give you pause. Throwing it out means casting aside all the memories associated with it, tossing out all the good and leaving a bitterness behind at what could have been. But keeping it as it is means that it isn't right. It isn't as it's supposed to be.
Let us imagine that the laws of reality are again undone and the world faces true annihilation. Do you honestly believe that half your number would sacrifice themselves to save the other? Of course they wouldn't! And if you had witnessed history unfold as I have, you would reach the same conclusion.
Emet-Selch can't just toss away what once was because it was so precious to him. Those memories that exist for us in the abstract are real for him. Real people gave their lives selflessly so the rest might live, and all he wants is to show them the same kindness, to honor their memory and sacrifice. This is incredible writing, because we can't hate Emet-Selch for this. We may personally find him annoying or weird or whatever, but we can't hate his morals and his purpose. He bids us to follow him through a recreation of the final days of Amarot, that we might experience firsthand how wrong everything was and test our worth. When we emerge on the other side of this narrative masterpiece of a dungeon, Emet-Selch says that his judgment remains unchanged. We are unworthy of being the inheritors to this star. One by one, our companions throw themselves at the Ascian, brandishing blade and word alike as we make our case that we are worthy, that no one's struggles are insignificant. And so he gives us one final chance, a do-or-die moment that would leave only the truly worthy standing.
The victor shall write the tale, and the vanquished become its villain.
This one line is so incredible. Even more than the generic every villain believes himself to be the hero of his own story cliche that it first appears to be. Emet-Selch knows that you won't back down unless you're completely destroyed, and that neither will he. If we win, he will just be another villain in our story that sought to cause suffering and destruction. But if he wins, then we will become the obstinate roadblock that impeded the noble pursuit of reuniting the Source and resurrecting the Fallen. His end goal isn't wrong, but the methods he is forced to take to bring this about makes him a villain, whereas the goal itself and our opposition to it make him an antagonist. Eventually, he even reveals his true name to us.
I am Hades, he who shall awaken our brethren from their dark slumber.
And asks us to cast aside titles and monikers, that we might clash as supposed equals. And when the fight starts, he breaks a convention established by every other end boss in Shadowbringers by not having a title. This isn't just a struggle of good versus evil against a world-ending threat anymore. It isn't the warrior of light and darkness battling a diabolical Ascian. This is a clash of faith. After the fight ends and the cutscene plays out, with us destroying Emet-Selch's primal form with Ardbert's Blade of Light, and our friends giving us aid, the scene fades up. The dawn has broken once more on this ruined landscape, and we see a rent Emet-Selch, looking melancholy, all bitterness gone from him in this moment as he begins to speak.
Remember. Remember us. Remember that we once lived.
And with a smile, he vanishes. In a way, we finally proved ourselves worthy of inheriting the world Emet-Selch sought to reunite. But that wasn't what his words were about. He knows that while he was defeated, it still means an end to the suffering and misery he has felt all this time. So he asks us to keep him and the other ancients in our memories, and perhaps to remember a bit of ancient life ourselves. And it's this moment in Shadowbringers that helps cement a long-running theme, one that I hadn't noticed actively until reading it in a random YouTube comment. The Ultima weapon and Laha Brea felt like threats to Eorzea, and that summed up A Realm Reborn rather well. You're only out to protect Eorzea, and your mind doesn't go far from that. A Realm Reborn gave the Warrior of Light a name. Nidhogg was a threat to Ishgard, and really reflected the first time you had to kill something that didn't deserve its lot in life. Heavensward gave the Warrior of Light their conscience. Stormblood gave us Xenos and the tyranny of Garlemald, and solidified the idea that moral ambiguity doesn't change what must be done. Stormblood gave the Warrior of Light a purpose. Shadowbringers challenged every one of these things by stripping the Warrior of Light of name, enemies, and ideology. Emet-Selch challenges everything that you are as the Warrior of Light and Darkness, and that is why this expansion is so brilliant. It digs so deeply into the psychology of the Warrior of Light and why they choose to fight. The Warrior of Light doesn't stand for light, they stand for life, for friends, and for tomorrow and tomorrow.
Defeat is not an option. I will strike you down. I will resurrect Lord Zodiac, and I will bring back those who sacrifice themselves to call him forth.
Elidibus was the character in Shadowbringers that I was sure I was going to actually hate. After the two previous fake-outs with Ardbert and Emet-Selch, I was 100% convinced that Elidibus would be the only true, irredeemable villain, not just an antagonist. All the way back in Dragonsong, we were getting hints as to his character. The schemer, the manipulator, the puppet master pulling the strings from beyond the protagonist's sight and reach. There didn't seem to be much depth that could be added to the character, and to tell the truth, I really didn't think there needed to be any depth at first. After so many antagonists that had me changing my mind and questioning my actions, I was ready for Elidibus to be a heartless monster that I could slay and return home to the source, doing my job as a hero. But, well, needless to say, things didn't quite pan out that way. Ardbert and Emet-Selch are fantastic antagonists on their own, but Elidibus is such a wonderful antagonist because he arrives after their denouement. Seeing him arrive under the guise of Ardbert after reanimating and possessing his corpse and using all the goodwill we'd garnered to trick the residents of the First into becoming warriors of light was a brilliant move, and I hate him for it. Preying on all of the hopeful, everyday working folk by playing into the idea that anyone can be a hero just like Ardbert and literally making that true was such a genius play, and I hate him for it. He takes us even further when we confront him, and he says that, because he is the last of the Unsundered Ascians, he cannot be reasoned with. He doesn't view Emet-Selch's moments of capitulation and willingness to see the other side as remnants of flawed humanity cracking the facade of perfection. He sees them as weakness. He refuses to let himself feel or acknowledge those things as real or valid, because to him, that's what got Emet-Selch killed.
I see you for what you are. You are death, and only in death shall you serve any purpose.
You can hear the conviction in his voice, the steadfast resolve forged and tempered by thousands of years of waiting, watching, and planning. There's hints of emotion there, but they're dulled somewhat, like he's hiding them. He speaks with such conviction that we can't seem to dismiss it as mere mind games. No one has ever spoken to us like this before as the Warrior of Light. Many of the other antagonists in the game speak to us as a Warrior of Light. a hero of legend and fable, knowing we are the only being even capable of stopping them. But Elidibus is different. He doesn't see a hero or a villain, he sees a murderer. We killed his brothers and sisters, sundered or otherwise, trapping their souls in Orosite or banishing them to the lifestream from whence they came. And he hates us for this. It isn't burning anger or suffocating despair, this is hatred. Killing Thordan or Shinryu felt right just because they were monsters, and their path of destruction wouldn't end unless we stopped them. The Sundered Ascians were the next link in the chain. They were similar to the other villains in that they couldn't be reasoned with, and they wouldn't rest until their goals were fulfilled, but they were just following orders. None of them actually remembered life before the Sundering, so to us they were just generic, super strong bad guys that we needed to kill. We never stopped to think about the ramifications of our actions, how taking a life means robbing its presence from those who would mourn its passing. And Elidibus reminds us of this.
Memories of a possible future, worthless. All worthless as memories of the only past, fated to fray and fade into oblivion, leaving naught but a gaping void.
We only ever stopped to think about all the lives who would be impacted by a death if that death was on our side. Papalymo, Izael, Minbrida, Minophilia, these deaths are impactful and stand out in the minds of both the players and the characters because we've gotten to know them. They aren't just abstracts dancing at the periphery of our understanding, they're people to us. Emet-Selch may have started it, but Elidibus fully reminds us that the Ascians we're slaying are people, with others who will mourn their passing. And with this, it puts us on opposing sides of the same fence.
That which I do is no different from that which you have done so many times, Warrior of Darkness. I arm myself, I hone my skills, I make ready to vanquish my enemy. You who have murdered my brothers, who have taken their selfless labors in service to the one true world and turned them to ash.
Ordinarily, this could really ring false if the characters were so unabashedly, mustachio-twirlingly, puppy-kickingly evil, but thankfully there aren't too many instances of that aside from La Habrea, who I genuinely hope does get some retroactive characterization in Pandemonium, to be honest. But when we discover his plan to use the Crystal Tower, and by extension the Crystal Exarch revealed to be Grahatia, as a battery to summon Warriors of Light from across the remaining reflections and use them to resume the flood of light on the first, everything begins to sink into place. He doesn't just have the conviction necessary to do what he thinks is right, he is conviction incarnate.
Though it take 1,000 years, upon my honor as Elidibus, emissary of the Convocation of 14, I will see this done.
And so, as we gear ourselves up mentally and physically to put an end to the ancient threat once and for all, things take an interesting turn. The Shade of Ancient Hythlodius tells us that Elidibus, before all of this, had always had an obsession with his duty as emissary, and that he may not even remember anything other than the task itself. When we confront him about this, he openly acknowledges that he has a job to do, even if he doesn't remember why he's doing it or for whose sake. Emet-Selch never forgot anything or anyone, and that's his driving motivation all throughout the story. Meanwhile, Elidibus has forgotten, and in his capacity as a primal born of the faith of those who would see him succeed, that's all he's left with. A desire to succeed, with no room for reasoning or purpose. Ardbert speaks within us to challenge this, saying that we too never forgot why we do what we do as warriors of light and darkness, and that this is the line that separates us. There exists the line between hero and villain. When we give him the same words that Emet-Selch gave to us, he refuses, beckoning the souls of the faithful warriors of light to give him strength, transforming into the primal version of the warrior of light.
For my people, for our world, I will strike you down.
We defeat him, and a staggering revelation is dropped on us. This return to Earth sheds some light on the person behind the primal, and as we give him the memory crystals of the other members of the Convocation, he finally recalls all the things he would not and could not before.
Yes, I would become him. I would save everyone. This, I believed. Yet still they cried out in rage and despair, divided over the fate of the star. A rare occurrence, always fleeting, but not this time. Not this time. Reconciliation. Elidibus. I was needed. I withdrew myself from Zodiark for them. My people, my brothers, my friends.
The fact that Elidibus' blind faith and lack of context and understanding is not just because he's a primal, but because he is a child. A child became the heart of Zodiark, broke free of his prison, lost literally everyone he has ever known and loved, and was slain in the performance of his sacred office. This isn't an adult with years of experience and depth of understanding behind him, giving context and coloring his emotions. This is a kid who got a taste of responsibility and respect, only to have it all ripped away and replaced with obligation and duty. This moment is utterly heart-wrenching, and it's hammered home by the fact that, again, we didn't have a choice. We aren't proud of this moment, we had to do something to even make this moment possible. Shadowbringers and its antagonists tell us a tale of context, perspective, and introspection. It asks us to, at the very least, consider our actions, as players and as people. It asks us to consider the feelings and struggles of those other than ourselves, to bear in mind the hardships of others when dealing with them at their worst. It strips away the facade of heroism and villainy, good and evil, light and shadow, and asks us to be kind, to be brave, to have hope, and most importantly, to remember.
Stay strong. Keep the faith. At duty's end, we will meet again. We will. We will. The rains have ceased, and we have been graced with another beautiful day. But you are not here to see it.
Above all else, the importance of story in MMORPGs is one of structure. If gameplay is the vehicle by which you traverse a video game, the story is the GPS. It provides direction and context for all the button pressing, grinding, and farming, and it's the reason people remember games so fondly more often than not. After the completion of any game, whether people are aware of it or not, one of two things remains in the player's mind. The story, if it is largely a single-player game, or the memorable experiences had and bonds forged if the game is largely multiplayer-driven. The gameplay itself largely takes a backseat mentally, as gameplay can be experienced at our leisure, over and over again. But the first time you fought a trial boss, or your first treasure dungeon, or even your first savage clear with your static, those are the things you never forget. What's amazing about Final Fantasy XIV is that because the game has a largely single-player oriented story, with other players only necessary for completion of multi-person duties and content, this allows us to have the best of both worlds. We can experience the story individually, and draw our own conclusions ourselves, while also being able to shelve the story for a moment to do typical MMO content when the moment strikes us. This acts as a sort of palate cleanser, preventing either the story or the grind from being too monotonous. Games like World of Warcraft that focus so tightly on gameplay lose players when that gameplay isn't up to snuff, causing issues like feature freeze or content droughts. This is a bleeding wound in those kinds of games, because save for an expansion or major expansion patch, these games slowly hemorrhage players who only care about content above all else. But in Final Fantasy XIV, because story is so important, the narrative is allowed to affect gameplay and vice versa. This allows players that only care about the story in minimal combat to be satisfied in having an emotional, powerful, impactful one hand-delivered every major patch and expansion, while those who only care about gameplay lose very little by way of time and skipping cutscenes to get to the meaty bits. Both kinds of players should be at odds by way of this fusion, but despite the fact they hate each other in-game, they both end up being catered to. I'm not against MMOs, but MMORPGs are where I belong. A living, breathing world that I feel like an actual part of will always be preferable rather than being a tourist at the proper noun factory. And it's Shadowbringers that ascended the story beyond the usual fare. It's the first time in my life I've ever stuck around for an expansion in a live service title like this. Shadowbringers left me with something that I thought I'd lost: faith in long-term projects and excitement to see their culmination. So Endwalker, I'm ready. Bring on the finale we all deserve. I made this video to highlight as many of the wonderful things about Shadowbringers as I could, but this is far from comprehensive. I don't know how many of these kinds of videos I'll end up making because they're a massive undertaking, but I sincerely hope you enjoyed this one. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, signed, RC.